We have breaking news out of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio has just emerged along with Mike Waltz from a meeting with the Ukraine side. They've had over 4 hours, and he announced that they actually have something agreed upon.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. I want to personally thank, we both want to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, His Majesty, for hosting us, for making this possible. They've been instrumental in this process, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us here today. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball's now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
That, and I think as a result of this positive step forward, the president has decided to lift the pause on aid and on our security assistance to Ukraine going forward, and that's effective immediately.
So there's some definite concrete results where they're, especially from the Ukraine side, that they got an end to the pause in intelligence and supplies that they were getting from the United States. So they're certainly going to be breathing a bit of a sigh of relief on that. But then we have to get into the bigger issues there. Where does this take us from here? Now, Secretary Rubio mentioned at the end of that we would be taking the negotiations, or what was discussed, to Moscow to see if they can find a solution to end that. There's been some reports already that Steve Witkoff, the other member of the negotiating team, is heading to Moscow possibly later this week. So apparently they're going to go very quickly. But I'm not sure that that's going to be a very fruitful situation for the United States, because the Russians have been pretty straightforward and, as far as I've seen, unequivocal in what they will and will not do. Here is Vladimir Putin himself talking on the issue of a ceasefire, and actually even before that, the what we've seen so far in the news. CBS News is reporting this. The Kiev Independent are both reporting that what they're talking about is a 30-day ceasefire, which apparently, unlike what the Ukraine was asking for before, which is a sky and a sea ceasefire, now it's a complete and total ceasefire. And they say, we'll do this as long as the Russian side agrees to it. But will the Russian side agree to it? Well, if you look at what Vladimir Putin said last December, well, I'll let him speak for himself.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
That was echoed later the same month and expanded upon by Sergey Lavrov, who said this.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
Yeah, it's hard for me to see why they would change that. Now, listen, this is even more compounded from the Ukrainian side, because literally hours before the meeting started, there was more than a 300 barrage missile, a drone strike, rather, the largest ever launched from Ukraine against Russia. A lot of them were sent to Moscow. Some were sent to the elsewhere in the Kiev region, launched into the Kursk area. So there was actually a mall hit in the Kursk area. There was an apartment building that was hit. You can see that there on the screen right there. There have been a total of 3 people killed. There's a parking lot that was set ablaze. There was some really dramatic footage on that. But one thing you notice from all of the targets is, number one, nearly all of them were shot down by the Russian side. They've become quite good at that. So I think this is the biggest one since November of last year, which also virtually all of them were shot down. Nothing significant was hit. And what was the purpose of this? Now, Ukraine has launched a number of attacks that did have military implications. They attacked fuel depots, fuel processing centers, ammo depots, things like that, things that are perfectly valid military targets. These appeared to have just gone after splashy targets, the side of an apartment building, a mall. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for that. And what do you think the Russian side is going to think? On the eve of you wanting to come to some kind of an agreement, a meeting with the United States to find a way to end the war, You throw these things in the capital city of Russia. And look, there's no military value for this whatsoever. And I mean whatsoever. Not tactical, not operational, and definitely not strategic. At the most, what this is going to do is it's going to stir the Russian hornet nest up. It's going to make them more angry. The last thing it's going to do is to make them conciliatory, to make them say, okay, all right, well, you threw a bunch of missiles at us. You killed some civilians. Sure, we'll go ahead and give you a ceasefire. We'll stop what we're doing. I'm telling you, they're not going to stop what they're doing. And let me just go to this map here, because we talked yesterday. We had a show about the Kursk area and the fact that the Russians had taken a lot. Well, I'm going to show you something now, because as it's turning out there, that the Russians haven't stopped there at all. That's not surprising. That was to be fully expected. This is the situation right now. And these dark red areas you see are additional areas that were taken just over the last 24 hours. And you see huge swaths now. They're actually into the city of Suja now. A whole portion, almost a quarter of the city, just since last night. All of this area here was in the contested zone. It's now in the offensive zone, where that's additional territory taken. And this is over in the Sumy area. This is in Ukraine territory, where Russia had been putting pressure on this one supply road here. They're continuing to put pressure on that. Now this area is even more in the contested zone, so Russia's getting closer to, cutting this off. But you see that they're almost going to be able to push this and collapse the whole thing from the north. And this is, this was just a little while ago, just a few days ago. All of this area was either in the Ukraine zone or contested zone, and now it's just collapsing in very, very rapid shape and going in. Now, what do you think the chances are that Russia, after making this big progress here, having this new operation into the area of Sumy, and there's apparently at least none depicted on this map, there's no defensive barriers on the Ukraine side of the border here. What do you suppose militarily is the chance that Russia will keep going with this Reds onslaught and then stop at the border right here and go no further? Seems to me pretty likely that they would continue on, especially when you zoom out of the map here in a little bit, and you can see how this is relatively close to Kiev. And there's, a lot of open space between them and Kiev, and there's not a lot of defensive barriers there if Russia were to really press this issue here on further. And obviously the issue on the Eastern Front continues to go on. There is no place, I don't see any reason why the Russian side would go to a temporary ceasefire. I mean, what would you want to do that for? I mean, you saw Sergey Lavrov said that what he called a pause or a truce. He said that's a road to nowhere. That's not going to solve anything. Putin has said that. We've shown you some comments from Sergey Rybkov, the deputy foreign minister. He said, we're not going to stop fighting until we have a ceasefire. Until we have an agreement, not a ceasefire to talk about an agreement. Because look, Russia, as Larry Johnson has said on our show a couple of times recently, the Russians have a lot of bad experience with that. When they have done ceasefires, it has allowed the Ukraine side to build up its forces, to get lots of weapons. You saw Sergey Lavrov specifically cite that in his comment that it's a road to nowhere. If you're in the military advantageous position, you have to have some compelling reason why you would want to stop your offensive operation. So the Secretary of State in that clip we showed you a second ago seems to, be happy that he got something to share. But I mean, if Steve Witkoff goes to Moscow, I'm pretty confident that I know what he's going to be told. He's going to be told, they may even play those two clips I just said. They don't have to say anything new. They're saying it's our stated position. We've never said anything except there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be a truce. We won't stop fighting until we have it. And here's the harsh truth of it, that the West needs to get through their head, that Ukraine needs to get through their head, though there's no evidence they're going to. And there's a lot of evidence that many in the West still don't get it. Russia doesn't need a deal. Despite all of these claims that people are saying that Russia's hurting and all this kind of stuff, there's pain points without question, but they're not, quote, hurting in the sense that it's going to compel them to reach some sort of a less than advantageous negotiated end. They're not going to, because the Minsk agreements that were signed by the West, that were signed by Kiev, were not worth the paper they were written on. They never implemented them. The deal that should have happened in Istanbul in 2022, which they had the outlines of, they got trashed and never went anywhere. Now, why would they now then say, after all of those failures, we're going to have a pause where the only benefactor or the primary benefactor is the Ukraine side, where they'll stop losing territory, they'll stop losing men, they have a chance to replenish their supplies, they'll have a chance to replenish their manpower because they're really critically short on manpower. I mean, it's just self-evident. You don't even have to continue going down the line. You see that the Russians would be fools to actually engage in a ceasefire to talk about it. What they want is a negotiated settlement where they get what they have asked for. Ryabkov also specified all the terms of Putin's 14 June declaration from last summer have to be accepted or they won't stop fighting. That means not just the administrative borders of the 4 oblasts. That means not just that the Ukraine side vow that they're not going to be in NATO. There's not going to be any peacekeeping forces. There's not going to be any kind of military alliance that they're going to have the capability of. And there is going to be a new election to where there is a valid someone to sign an agreement with. And there's going to be a demilitarization to where their forces are at some very small number. 85,000 is the number I've heard. They allegedly have somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 right now, which means 700,000 to 600,000 people have to be demobilized and taken out of the military. So you can see that would be kind of hard to agree to, because what the Ukraine side continues to ask for is that they wanted a partial ceasefire, but apparently behind the scenes, and we expected this, the United States was probably pretty hardcore. And what they told them is that we ain't going to agree to any of that. So we're not going to say, yes, you're going to, like the parliamentarian that we showed you just yesterday's show, is that he wanted the ability to continue to have a military alliance with whomever they felt like. They did not want to change their constitution. Ergo, they're not going to demilitarize. They're not going to, well, they may have an election, but they're not going to give autonomy to the Russian speakers anywhere in the Ukraine. They're not going to change any of that, they said. And they want the future possibility to get back the lands they would temporarily cede to Russia. I mean, that's fantasy. That they might as well say we want Vladimir Putin to come to Kiev to sign a surrender instrument. I mean, they might as well have done that. That has just as much capability as that passing. The Ukraine side is going to have to somehow break through this mental barrier that it doesn't allow them to see reality. If Steve Witkoff goes to Moscow and says, hey, they've agreed to a ceasefire, then it's going to be a really short meeting, because Sergey Lavrov or Vladimir Putin, whoever he talks to, is going to say, I guess that's fine. If they want to stop fighting, that they can. We won't. We're going to keep going on. The Ukraine side, according to the Ukraine media, I read just a minute or two before we came on the air here, they said, well, we'll ceasefire as long as Russia agrees to all those terms, which means there's not going to be a ceasefire. I mean, I'll just go out on a limb and just say right now, there won't be a ceasefire, because unless the Russians have a dramatic change of heart to where they're going to work against their own interest, they're not going to. And I've never seen them work against their own interest. And so that's going to continue on. And meanwhile, the other thing that's just a stick in the eye, that if they even had some fantasy about doing something like that, that was really undercut by the Ukraine side. And I don't think that this was without purpose. This largest ever, I think, drone strike into Moscow and into the Kursk region and several other places in Russia on the morning that these negotiations were supposed to start. They wanted to poke a stick in Russia's eye, I think, so that Russia wouldn't agree to anything anyway. That then would give them the freedom to agree to the Americans, to get Trump off their back and say, okay, we're going to be willing to do this. Now I need you to turn back on the supplies, and I need you to turn back on the intelligence capability. So they succeeded in that. I think they also succeeded in the Russian part. Well, they didn't succeed in changing it because Russia didn't change, but they have solidified it. And in fact, after that drone strike, the Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, responded to the combination of the strike and the talks like this.
Переговоров нет, поэтому здесь пока нечего срывать. Но то, что можно изрядно подпортить наметившуюся тенденцию, это да. Разумеется, Соединенные Штаты, как страна, которая проявляет инициативу в плане поисков путей мирного урегулирования вокруг Украины. После сегодняшних контактов в Джидде с украинцами проинформируют российскую сторону о результатах. Это нормальная практика. А когда и как это сделает американская сторона, мы своевременно.
Okay, so that was before the Rubio announcement there. So he didn't know what had been announced yet, but he says they're ready to receive Witkoff and they'll listen to what he has to say and then they'll respond accordingly. But you saw at the first part of that, he said, well, there hasn't really been any negotiations yet, so there's not a whole lot to damage, but this certainly does damage the prospects of what's going on right now. I mean, that's an understatement that Peskov typically is pretty calm about how he says things, and he was probably pretty understated there. But you just have to understand, I mean, who would be okay with that? Because let's look at that strike, first of all. As I pointed out, there was no military targets even attacked. Ukraine has sometimes attacked military targets. This wasn't. Therefore, this was not associated with the war. This was not associated with trying to improve their situation on the battlefield, to try to limit Russia's ability to supply their front lines with fuel, with ammunition, with onward movement, like hitting trains or bridges or anything like that. It had no military value at all. It was into cities, and it hit some buildings, killed some civilians, which is just going to make the Russians really unhappy, but it's not going to do anything toward the war. So the only rational explanation can be that they wanted this to disrupt the negotiations because they don't want the war to end. Now, many times I've reiterated this, that there are some delusional folks on the Ukraine side, and at least from a certain perspective, you can understand why they're so delusional, because their brains can't get wrapped around the fact that to agree to what's plainly visible in front of you, what's graphically true on the ground, is just horrible to consider and agree to, so that it becomes permanent and solidified. And you want to have this idea that you can have a fantasy that, well, maybe if we get more stuff from Trump, what, it's not going to happen. But you can see where a delusional mind who has to live with the consequences of that may reach that conclusion. It's harder when it's people in the West. And many times I'll show you math from the Institute for the Study of War, and I'll often say they're terrible on analysis, but really good on maps, etc. Here's why I say they're really bad on analysis. Here is the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, or one of the senior figures, General Jack Keane.
Certainly, Russia has grown into a major adversary and threat of the United States. Clearly, they have this limitless partnership, as they define it, with China. They've embraced North Korea and Iran as well, and they all coordinate and cooperate together. And you can see the significant assistance that China, Iran, and North Korea are providing to Russia, and they have helped them get through this war. Make no mistake about that. Yes, and Russia, clearly, we know for a fact that Russia wants to topple the government in Ukraine and wants to move into former Soviet Union countries in Eastern Europe. That's a fact. This is not disputable. These are their ambitions. And he's a war criminal in how he fights a war. Thousands of children have been kidnapped and taken into Russia. That is a war crime in of itself. Who ever heard of doing anything like that? These people are evil. That's the reality of it. And certainly we've got to help Ukraine end this war on their terms.
So it's the classic thing. Russia evil, Ukraine good. Putin wicked, Zelensky a hero. That's it. And now once you know that, nothing else matters. And anything else I say, you just do this, north and south. That's all I'm looking for. That's all he wants. Just whatever he says, whatever comes out of his mouth, go, yeah, because Russia is evil. Therefore, they are capable of no good. Ergo, they have no valid position. So we don't even have to consider them. So we'll just look at what's going on our side of the ledger and what we want to be true. And then he says other ridiculous things like, it is for a fact, he said several times there, it is an indisputable fact, he said, that Russia wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Well, it's not a fact. As a matter of fact, what is true, what is on the record, is that Russia has repeatedly said that is not their objective. What they have said is their objective is they want security on their western border. They do not want the NATO alliance on their western border. They do not want a force that is willing to fight a war with them on their western border. And they want that closed off. So whether you think they're evil or not, any leader of any nation wants security physically on their borders. We certainly do. We want our borders protected, and we're doing whatever it takes to do that. So that's a reasonable thing to want to do. But to just say, ignore that part of it and instead categorize Russia as just being basically Hitler too, or a Hitler wannabe for Putin. That's what he's saying there. That goes against the actual evidence, because Putin had tried since 2015, just obey the Minsk agreement that you agreed to. That was guaranteed by the Germans and by the French. Just agree to what you agreed to. We'll follow suit on our side. We'll withdraw our forces. We'll withdraw our military support. We'll do all of that kind of stuff as long as you do the key thing there, which was to change your constitution. But you see, the Ukrainians yesterday said to this day, just I think it was 3 days ago when the statement was made, they're not going to change their constitution. They don't want to. So Russia's saying then the reasons for the war will continue on. And as long as their security is threatened on their border, they're going to continue fighting until they can either resolve it by diplomacy or they'll do so by military force. So Jack Keane is dead flat ass wrong when he claims that Russia is for a fact only wants to conquer. If that were true, they would not have attempted to follow the Minsk agreements, because that would have ended the situation on the spot. They would not have issued another opportunity short of war in December 2021 that would have prevented war and that would have secured their flank on their border and would have prevented NATO from ever coming into it. He would not have agreed 2 months into the war to end it in Istanbul. He would not have agreed again in the summer of 2024 and offered another opportunity to end the war and to end the fighting and a permanent solution. He said at the time, he was very clear, not looking for a ceasefire, looking for a permanent resolution. You've seen Sergey Lavrov just a couple of days ago said that until the root causes of the war are addressed, we're not going to just stop fighting. It makes no sense. Those are the actual facts, as evidenced by things that have physically happened, things that are physically stated. Nothing that Jack Keane said there is true. If you try to form policy on an understanding of the circumstances that is based in fiction, and then you make some kind of a policy based on that, and we're talking about Trump here, or anybody in the West for that matter, if you try to base policy based on the fiction world that Jack Keane talks about, and he's definitely not the only one, then you are virtually guaranteeing failure. Until you look at the world as it is, whether you like it or not, whether you think Putin is right or not, even if you think Putin is evil, you still have to recognize the reality, the truth, that Putin wants security on his border, and he will do whatever it takes to provide it like any good nation would. If he can get it with negotiations, he will. That's why they continue to say we're wide open to negotiations. We've never said anything besides that. The Ukraine side has a law prohibiting them from negotiating with Vladimir Putin. That's got to change somehow. They have a president that has exceeded his term of service, and he uses his own power to keep martial law in effect, which at least in the law in the Ukraine gives him the ability to literally serve indefinitely. There's nothing right now that would compel him internally to have a new presidential election. Doesn't sound very democratic to me. We had an election during our civil war, so it doesn't seem like it's a big ask to insist that they do the same thing. Russia had an election in the year 2024, like the Ukraine was supposed to have. They were having a war in the middle, and they still had one. So lots of problems with what the Ukraine side is claiming. And now then they're making big demands that they don't have the capacity to back up. Now, on the positive side, it does appear that President Trump is aware of a lot of these things. He was asked on Air Force One a couple of days ago, do you think that the Ukraine side actually wants peace?
Well, I think they will sign the minerals deal, but I want them to want peace. Right now,
how do they show that? How do they show that?
Well, right now they haven't shown it to the extent that they should. I think right now they haven't, but I think they will be, and I think it's going to become evident over the next 2 or 3 days. And we want to do anything we can to get Ukraine to be serious about getting something done. I say they don't have the cards. Nobody really has the cards. Russia doesn't have the cards. They don't have. What you have to do is you have to make a deal. And you have to stop the killing. It's a senseless war, and we're going to get it stopped.
You know, one of the first things that he said there is, I want Ukraine to want peace. And I think there's evidence they don't. I mean, you saw in yesterday's show, showed you what a parliamentarian is saying is their deal, what they want. You saw the actions that Ukraine took this morning on the very eve, just hours before the negotiations were set to start with the United States on reaching a conclusion. They took action, physically attacked Moscow, physically attacked several portions in Russia that was exclusively designed to make them not want to have a deal. So I think it's a pretty valid question. Does the Ukraine side want peace? I think that they don't. I think that, let me qualify that. I don't think that Zelensky wants to end the war on terms he doesn't like. I think that was Keane said at the end of his comment there that they want to reach negotiated settlement on terms favorable to Kiev. I mean, come on, man. That doesn't exist. And if you're holding out for that, it's not just an academic issue. It's not just a eye-rolling kind of situation. Men are dying every single day while you pursue fiction. And that goes for Jack Keane as well as it does for Volodymyr Zelensky. And one has to wonder, how much longer will the population in Ukraine continue to passively sit there and watch that guy lead them to just absolute destruction? I mean, that's what Adolf Hitler did on a larger scale at the end of World War II when the Soviet Union was rolling in. After the Second Battle of Kursk, if you know your Second World War history, there was a huge loss for the Germans there. That was the finality of their last ability to conduct an offensive operation. The war was effectively already over before that because Germany no longer had the power to physically defeat the armies of the Soviet Union. So it was kind of a pointless operation, but they tried it anyway and they lost. From that time forward, it was nothing but a drive back. Any rational person could have seen there's no way we can't stop this anymore. If we keep fighting, we'll literally get the entire country destroyed, which is what happened. People in charge like that don't think rationally very often. Sometimes they do. He didn't. And he was physically killed as a result of it, had to commit suicide, and he took all of his countrymen with him. Millions of people died from the time of that second Kursk battle all the way to the inevitable roll into Berlin. Something similar, I think, on a smaller scale is unfolding here. The Russians, again, are in the position of strength. They have everything that you need to sustain and accelerate their capacity to fight on the conventional battlefield. Ukraine is losing by the day. Their army is getting smaller by the day. They cannot replace the losses, and the people that they put in to replace the losses aren't as good as the ones that were taken out. Every time you lose somebody who had 5 or 6 years or 10 years experience in the military, it cannot be replaced. You can put another man in a uniform and send him in that slot, but it can't replace him because you can't make experience. It can only be gained in a one-for-one time. That's it. So every day they lose the capacity. And now then they're also losing terrain. As I showed you in that map in the Kursk area, it is shocking how fast that has fallen. After 7 months of just nibbling at the edges and just lots of positional battles, lots of Ukrainians were getting killed. But now it's evident that that was always an intentional desire for the Russian side, because when they chose to take it back, they moved with incredible speed. And it is really falling fast. Now, I don't know how much harder the Ukraine are going to fight inside Suja city, but you saw in that first map there that a quarter of the city itself has fallen since just yesterday's update. So there's not a whole lot left south of that, and those pincers are cutting in the bottom of it. So that thing could be gone really quick. So what Zelensky had claimed was going to be a bargaining chip to try to get something back. I saw in a report this morning that he had some fantasies about saying, all right, tell you what, Vlad, I'm going to give you back Kursk. I'm going to give you your own country back here. And in return, I'm going to take a nuclear power plant down in I think it's the Kherson region, Energdal, I think it's called, on the Dnieper River. And that was a fantasy. Russia's held that from the beginning of the war, and they would never, under any circumstances, give that back to Ukraine because they need it for the power generating capacity, which Russia has been methodically disintegrating and destroying for the last 30 or so months. So they're certainly not going to hand that back over. But it was a fantasy to think that under any circumstances, anything that Ukraine had, that Russia would trade in order to get its country back when they have the capacity to take it, which they have done. So now then we have, because you have this basically machine, this war machine on every capacity that you need on the Russian side, and you have collapsing everything on the Ukraine side and an unwillingness to deal with reality. You have a setup situation where if you don't agree to this, just like, say, maybe at the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945, Germany had the possibility of saying, all right, we can't, there's the resources simply don't exist. The manpower, it just doesn't exist. We're going to have to capitulate. We'll either reach a negotiated settlement or we'll literally just capitulate. Then all those men would have stayed alive. Berlin would have not been destroyed. And all the stuff in the eastern part of the country would have never been destroyed. And instead, because of Hitler's obsession with trying to turn things around, the result was the absolute annihilation of his country. And I think that's what the Russians are preparing to do and are prepared to do. And I know for certain that there are many of the hawkish elements in the Russian army that want nothing but that. Some of them were terrified that there would be some kind of a meaningful deal that Trump would agree to, that Putin would agree to, that would stop the war short of their maximalist gains, which is at the very minimum up to the Dnieper River, to include Odessa in the south and Kharkiv in the north. Many Russians urgently are politicking to try and get that on the target list. If there's a deal, that's negotiable. If Trump was able to literally just say, all right, Putin, everything that you want diplomatically, we're going to give you all the lines, everything that you asked for in June 15th, as bad as that would be on one certain aspect politically, because Trump would be excoriated if he agreed to it. I mean, he would pay a big political capital. I would recommend him doing that anyway, because the alternative is going to be, okay, you guys don't want to agree to that, and this is what I think you should do. I think Trump should say, I'm willing to do that, and then put it on Zelensky and Yermak and all these other leaders they have there, Umarov. You guys don't want to take it. You don't want this to end in, like, say, January 1945. You want to fight all the way to April. You have at it. You guys in Europe, you want to support them, that's on you. I'm not going to do any of it. And then Russia will do whatever it's going to do. Because if we don't, Russia's still going to do whatever it's going to do. And say, now then, it doesn't even have any concerns about saying, well, we tried peace. We offered it to you. You didn't take it. So now we're going to roll forward. And I think that's the way it's most likely to end up at this point, unless somebody inside the Ukraine side takes action like has happened many times before and conducts a coup, or if Zelensky realizes one's coming and flees and takes his life somewhere else so he can live. I don't know, but that's probably the only thing that can keep Ukraine from following in the footsteps of the Third Reich in early 1945, instead of going to full destruction. We'll see how that's going to work out here. But I want to bring Gary back in here, because I want to delve on that a little bit, Gary, on the Zelensky part, because I still, even as much as I've said here, I still have a hard time understanding why so many people in Kiev, they have to know everything that we talk about here. We're seeing this second, third hand. They're living it. Many cases they have, classified reports that we don't have access to. They can see all this stuff. At some point, Gary, don't they have to say, okay, Zelensky, we're not going to just sacrifice our lives for your vanity?
They'll have to, right? At some point, I guess he's gonna proclaim, he was the hero. Hey, I tried everything I could. I wanted a ceasefire. I agreed to a ceasefire. What more could you ask me to do?
And the answer is, well, there is more we could ask you to do. It's agree to the thing here. But if let's play with that for a second. So Zelensky apparently has agreed to. Yermak was actually conducting the negotiations. Zelensky, I think, is still in Saudi Arabia. So I guess maybe there'll be some comment coming from him later today. Certainly we'll be looking for that.
He actually did. He's put out a video already, Danny.
Oh, did he?
I didn't grab it. He didn't say anything except that he's in agreement to the ceasefire.
Okay. Well, and that was a full ceasefire, so that's not what they wanted. But have you seen anything else from the Kremlin since that time?
No, I've been looking. No, I see no reactions directly, either from the Kremlin, obviously not from Putin directly, Peskov. No, not yet.
Yeah. So, well, that's. I mean, what do you project is going to happen from the Russian side?
No, I agree with you, Danny. That there's how much more forthright and precise could they be, Putin and Lavrov, the two biggest spokespersons there are for Russia. He's called it a road to nowhere. I don't see Lavrov backpedaling an inch on that.
Well, do you think, Gary, that, I mean, to what extent do you think that there's any plausibility that, like the Jack Keens who keep saying, no, Russia's hurting a lot worse than you think. They needed a ceasefire because they're losing so many men. They just can't keep this going any longer. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Danny, you've been pretty clear about in documenting the reality, the non-reality of how much pain Russia is feeling. And like you said, my gosh, with the manpower that they have, they can take the bigger hit, a much bigger hit. There's just no comparison. So if they are, bleeding it out as much as Keene likes to think they are, they're not. He can proclaim that all day long. We don't see, or you don't see evidence, and you listen. You scour the back channels and your sources, and I don't see it either, Danny, on my end, where they're hurting as much as the West tries to proclaim that they're hurting.
And what do you think of the Boris Johnsons? How are they going to come out of this when, they had a chance to end this in April 2022? We talk about that a lot. And ultimately, it's Zelensky's call. So Johnson may have had a lot of influence, but he wasn't in authority, so he couldn't tell Zelensky take or not take. But he does seem to really be telling him not to. And then he's gone out of his way, even in the last couple of months, to reiterate that was the right call back then. How do you think history is going to take that?
Well, history is a different thing, but in the immediate history, in the immediate time, I think people like Johnson, they'll double down. They'll in a sense, Zelensky will be somewhat heroic for willing to accept or to willing to sign on to a ceasefire deal. Again, I could see them saying, yes, what more could he do? That is the ultimate of, being willing to show his reasonableness for negotiation by doing that. When we know really what should be done and what needs to be done, at least as far as Russia is concerned.
Yeah, and I think that, I guess talking about doubling down, we've used a few times on the show this clip from May 2023, where David Petraeus went out and in a lot of detail explained why the Ukraine side was just about to launch this offensive operation, why they would win, why the defensive side would crumble. And you remember, I think it's earlier this month, we had an updated version from Petraeus. Do you still have that? I'd like to pull that up if we do.
Yeah, give me a second.
Yeah,
Just
see if you can,
just
see if you can find it there.
Look.
But I think it's really instructive to say, even graphic facts can't change somebody who's ideologically wedded to that view and have welded their character and their reputation to a certain outcome. They can't detach and pull it back off. Petraeus in particular did the same thing with Afghanistan. He was the one who lied about how good it was going in 2010, 2011. It was on the right track, right azimuth, all that nonsense. And it kept telling the American people in Congress it was going good. And then, of course, when it collapsed predictably in August of 2021, he then went back on TV and said, everybody, gosh, if only they'd listened to me because I had it in a good place. And then they blew it. And unfortunately, the cameras keep rolling in there. So
if nothing else, he's consistent, Danny.
What will be the cost of guaranteeing Ukraine's security? What do we need to get this deal done?
Well, in an ideal world, we would put Ukraine in a position of strength relative to Russia that it's not quite in right now. And that would be defined as enabling Ukraine so much that they are able to change the dynamics on the battlefield so that Russia, Putin, finally recognizes that he can't achieve additional gains at acceptable cost. And that would require additional support, funding, security assistance, et cetera, from Europe, from the United States, and ideally would include the bulk of, if not all of, the $300 billion of frozen assets that Russia has in European banks.
So that first part there is just profound. He said, we want to put Ukraine in a position of power vis-a-vis Russia that they're not quite in right now. But what are you talking about that they're not quite in right now? It's continuing to go out of balance as we speak. What could possibly turn it around when everything that we've done in the past has done nothing to slow that down? But he still says it with a straight face.
Yeah, he does. He's a believer, Danny. He's a firm believer.
And you've worked, I think it was 17 years in Fox News before you joined Judge Knapp and then our channel here. So you got a lot of knowledge about how the SIP works. Why do these major outfits keep putting a mic in his face when he's been so wrong on so many issues?
Yeah, I think well, part of it I think is, some of them are emotionally tied to it, meaning that, the idea of an underdog, somebody like Ukraine, they were, an unprovoked attack. We've got to stand up and fight for the democracy on their side. So we've got people that are willing to promote that idea, and so that's part of it, Danny. Whether they're accurate, whether they're correct, it's besides the point. When you've got a narrative that you want to promote, and the narrative, often will win out. Listen, I don't have to explain that to our audience. We've seen narratives that get pushed all the time that have nothing to do with reality, and thankfully, that's why they have lost. The legacy media have lost their credibility because they were willing to do that.
Yeah, I guess you're right. And then one of the reasons why they keep losing viewership, I know, I think it's CBS, MSNBC, CNN for sure. They're bleeding so many viewers that they're having to cut anchors. I think MSNBC is going to have to cut some major anchors, and they don't seem to get it. They don't seem to understand why the bleed, because they had it. They had it all.
Just today in the press briefing, Caroline Levitt celebrated the Washington Post because they actually admitted that they're revamping their newsroom, and they are reestablishing some other guidelines and protocols. So in a sense, they're almost admitting, listen, we've been on the wrong path here. We've got to make some adjustments with this new administration. Maybe we should take another look at how we provide our information. She wasn't clear on the specifics. I didn't see the story myself as to what exactly these new protocols or guidelines on, but they are in a sense turning over a new leaf. So it'll be curious to see, how different a leaf the Washington Post will be.
And I saw it was either yesterday or the day before that there was one of their opinion writers, I think, had written a piece that the Post chose not to publish, and they were so upset that, how dare you curtail or not publish something that I wrote, that they actually quit. And one wonders behind the scenes, what did they write? Because that part hadn't been revealed yet, because it could be part of this revamp that they were going to write something that was not real, was not true, and was purported in a narrative that couldn't be sustained. And who knows, maybe it's a positive sign. I mean, anything that's going to get the truth out there, I'm all for, but I'm skeptical that they'll succeed.
Oh yeah, I don't know. Bezos is still Bezos, so I don't know. He's willing to kiss up to Trump, but is he willing to make a full mea culpa with his business strategy regarding about the news itself that's coming out? That would be remarkable if he does that.
It would be. I guess we can always, hope springs eternal. Let's hope that happens. But one way or the other, even if they don't do it because it's the right thing to do, if they keep bleeding viewers and subscribers, that'll lead you to do a lot of things the right way if that's what pays the bill. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's been a long road down for him since he's bought it. It's not like it's ever done well. So he was certainly committed while Biden was in power. So he was willing to take the hits. At least with that entity, he's got other entities that I'm sure are doing well. But as far as the Post goes, he was willing to go down with that ship. But now he's we'll see what the adjustment looks like.
We will see. But listen, we're going to keep following this developing situation here, especially as we find anything about what happens on the Russian side and anything further with any details once we have, because this stuff literally just happened. I'm sure a lot of the details are still trying to be disseminated. But as we find out anything further, definitely if we see anything further on the battlefield, any of these developments, we will keep you informed and updated, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth.
Definitely. And Danny, and a big day tomorrow. Professor Jeffrey Sachs at noon, Colonel Doug McGregor at 2. So please tune in. That's going to be a great doubleheader.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, looking real forward to that, especially with all this stuff happening now. I'll be really interested in hearing what both of those guys have to say. You won't want to miss it either. Thanks, and we'll see you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.